In the room now and have more people joining us this morning. So delighted to see everyone here today for Removing Our Blinders. For those of you who I haven't met, though I see many familiar faces in the audience, I'm Debbie Nelson with Together SC, and I am here to host a Removing Our Blinders session, which we have been doing for about 2 years now, maybe even more. We started it during COVID. And I am delighted to introduce two actually really dear friends of mine, people that I've worked with for a long time, who will be sharing some really interesting insights. As you well know, Removing Our Blinders is something that we created to allow this space for us to hear from, in particular, white leaders and their focus, their evolution in regards to racial equity, and for them to share some of their own personal stories and how it has really impacted their leadership. And so today we are lucky to have in the room Gage from the Hollingsworth Funds, who will be sharing some stories with us. I see many Greenville friends in the audience, and I think that may be because Gage is here. Gage is the president and CEO of the Hollingsworth Funds, a large grant maker in the Greenville community. And I just love to watch the evolution of this organization. I say I've known Gage for almost 12 years now. And the vision that I love is they're ensuring a vibrant, just, and inclusive Greenville. I think there's been an evolution to getting to this vision. And I think Gage is going to share with us some stories and anecdotes about that. Also today, we are fortunate to have Gage's colleague, his partner in his work, his VP of Strategic Investments, Tamala Spann. I know many of you, of course, in Greenville and Spartanburg know Tamala, but we know her statewide as one of our board members for Together SC. So I'm delighted that Tamala is going to challenge Gage a little bit today, we hope, or at least reflect on what he says. Tamala
challenges me on a daily basis.
But she's already challenging him, so this is not going to be new. But we also hope many of you in the room might want to challenge Gage. I know I've known Gage long enough to know he likes a really good question. So no questions off the table. So we have a chat box for all of you to include questions and thoughts about what you hear. So yes, I hope that all of you will do that. So with that, I turn it over to Gage, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks, Gage.
Well, thanks, Debbie. I appreciate it. And Debbie is a good friend and a longtime friend, so I'm happy to participate. And also apologize, for the last time. I was a little bit smarter this go around. I did not order sushi on a Monday night or Tuesday night or whatever it was. The last time, for those of you who were expecting to see me a little while back, the old food poisoning thing is not fun. So I was much smarter and had a very plain piece of chicken and some water before seeing you today. But thanks again for inviting me to be a part of this today. And I really just want to kind of thank everyone on the call. We do have a lot of friends and folks and partners and colleagues in the Greenville area for sure. And I think we all have sort of a shared commitment to change in our community and to really making sure that everyone's got an opportunity to really advance and thrive, and that's the core of the work. And so, I really thank all of you for the work that you're doing, and we're at Hollingsworth excited to be a part of that. So I'm going to kind of do things a little bit differently today. For those of you who know me, you're going to hear just a little bit more about my personal story and my background, and some of the things that have influenced me along the way. We can get into the Hollingsworth stuff and approach maybe a little bit more into the back and forth. I'll certainly share a little bit about that as well, but I also want you to hear from Tammy. She's really an unbelievable colleague and has been with Hollingsworth Funds almost from the start. She was the first hire that I made, and she's had a huge influence on me and my leadership as well. But a little bit about me. I grew up on Long Island, on the North Shore of Long Island, about 30 miles from New York City. I was raised in a two-parent household. My dad was volunteered for a couple of tours in Vietnam and went to work as a stockbroker, literally kind of getting coffee and worked his way up. Very self-made in sort of a 30-year plus career. My mom was a second grade teacher for a little while, and also then a special needs teacher for students with mental and physical disabilities, and then ultimately a stay-at-home mom for myself and my younger brother. From an education perspective, Long Island is where I grew up in Long Island is definitely a wealthier part of the country and part of New York. My education was through private schools, from elementary through high school. I went to 4-year, college at University of Richmond and got a bachelor's degree there, and ultimately my MBA after that. And I was in the early part of my life, I wasn't thinking about anything related to what I do today. I was playing a lot of golf. I was a big golfer as a junior. I played for my high school team. I played all 4 years in college and was the captain of the team there, and had a brief professional career actually on kind of the mini tour circuit. Realized very quickly I was never going to be good enough to kind of be a PGA Tour star. So that career ended fairly quickly, and then I spent a few years actually in sort of the sports management world. I was a tournament director of all things for the senior men's tennis tour. So I was handed sort of a couple $1 million budget in my early, mid 20s, and was directing events all around the country. And so I share that just because that's not your average, route to where I am today. And I had without question, had a very advantaged upbringing, one that I've learned to appreciate and understand just how advantaged that was, over time. But, I grew up in a predominantly, really an all-white neighborhood. And, the schools that I attended were predominantly white as well. And, even, kind of my social circles, really for the first, I'd say probably like 25 years of my life. And, Long Island, which should feel like a melting pot given where it is and its location, close to New York. And it has so many different races and ethnicities and people from all kinds of different backgrounds. But it's also one of the most kind of residentially segregated places in the country. So it's very, we kind of grew up pretty isolated, and everyone on Long Island grew up pretty isolated. And so I had, admittedly kind of little exposure to people of different races, ethnic backgrounds, even from a socioeconomic perspective as well. And I think when you're because of that isolation, I think I was also exposed to a lot of kind of negative stereotypes, right, about people who are different from me. And that was just about part of the environment that I was raised in. I'm not saying that my parents were directly that way, but just a lot of the kind of social circles and educational circles that I were in, there was a lot of sort of othering going on, I guess is the best way to put it. Not that I really realized it at that time in my life. And I'm not saying that to sort of, play the shame or blame game or feel like I have some, level of guilt because of it. I think it's very much a product of the environment around me. And I think the more isolated you are, the more blinders that, you carry. And I certainly had a lot of those. There were two, I think, kind of moments in my life that put me sort of on a different path to where I am today. And they both sort of coincided with each other. So during the summer of 2001, I had kind of run my course with the tennis tour and everything I'd been doing before, and really having sort of this moment in my life where I'm like, all right, what am I going to do? I think we all have this at some stage in our life of, hey, what do I really want to do with my life? And I decided to go get my MBA, not so much because I knew, not so much because I knew what I wanted to do in life, but more so because I didn't. And I had an opportunity and advantage in a lot of ways to use that as an avenue to both preserve my flexibility, but also take the time to reflect and really think about sort of the inflection point in the period in life that I was in. And but it also, that time also coincided with 9/11, and it was obviously we just had the anniversary of 9/11 on Sunday, but I was there in New York City when that happened. I also had a good friend of mine whose sister died in the towers. And so I think for me, that was I don't know, that was like a first a real kind of like shock or shift in my life. And the timing was good. It made me really kind of rethink sort of what I cared about, what my values were. And so I spent really kind of the first sort of year or so of my MBA really thinking about, what are some of the values that are core to me, and how do I want to translate those into the next steps of my career. And I obviously my parents transferred a lot of values, as most of many of our family members tend to do. And there were a couple in there, one in particular, just sort of this very basic idea of treating everyone with dignity and respect. I remember my mom, since I mentioned her, as a special needs teacher. I think I don't know exactly, I don't have this memory exactly right, probably, but I can remember being kind of 10, 11 years old and making some sort of like off color, comment or something about kids with disabilities in the car, and my mom like wheeling around and, reading me the riot act of, how even something that I thought was funny was not appropriate. And I remember her taking me to, she took me to the class that she was teaching at some point, and had me interact with the same students that I was maybe making fun of sort of unintentionally. And it was a really clear reminder of the importance of how everyone, no matter whether it's disability or race or income or any other issue, that we all, that's kind of a basic fundamental right, and we need to be conscious of that. And the other piece is just not judging people until you get to know them, right? I mean, be empathetic and get to really understand the core of people and what motivates them and what their fears are and challenges and hopes and dreams are, before you judge them. And I talked a little bit about sort of this othering that kind of, I think I was exposed to when I was growing up. And some of that's obviously was related to kind of race and income, and a lot of that like related to like occupation, right? So people working in the service sector, or and I remember my dad. Like he always knew. So he took the train and commuted into New York, and it was amazing the people that he interacted with, how much he knew about them, right? Whether it was the train conductor, the bagel guy, the mail delivery lady in the office, he always knew about their families. He knew what they were up to. And they knew him, and they knew about me. And it was a really interesting reminder of sort of the importance of getting into relationships with folks, getting to know people. And I found out later in life that he had quietly help support people, in various ways, whether, in some ways it was kind of small financial stuff, but in others it was using his social capital to open up doors and, sort of remove barriers for folks either to move up in their position or what have you. And so those two things really kind of stuck with me, made me think about, how I can sort of live out some of those values in my career. And so, the long story short version is, I went through this process during that time in my life and kind of came out the other end with 3 ideas of what I think I could do in my career. And one was to be a history teacher, but I wasn't sure about the wearing the three-piece corduroy suit and, being a professor out in the University of Montana or something. I thought a lot about becoming a psychiatrist, and really thinking about that just helping people in that way. But I'm super impatient, and I didn't think that I would last long enough to get through med school and all that. And so I landed on, going into a career in philanthropy of all things. So I really sort of came to this on my own, accord, but the through line was definitely about giving back, was definitely about helping others. And I landed at a place that was really my starting point, and became a 10-year career at Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. And I was very lucky, frankly, to find my way into a position there. They were looking for a bit of a generalist. I was a philanthropic advisor. I was still pretty young as it relates to people in that field, and I didn't have any necessarily social connections to get myself there, and so I had to kind of create my own network and really sort of just learn about that field. And I found my way there. But I had somebody who hired me who was the number 2 in the organization, who served as a real mentor and champion for me. And basically, in a 3-year span, I felt like I had been in philanthropy for 30 years. And he put me in situations that where I was off on my own and, just throwing me into the deep end. And there were 2 important kind of lessons that helped shape my thinking today. And one of those was the importance of proximity, and again, sort of building relationships, getting to know people and understand people. And the other one was the importance of really the role that systems play in determining outcomes, right? I'm not abdicating individual responsibility or any of that kind of stuff, but just an understanding that, look, there are systems at play and forces at play that, even for people who are trying to get ahead and are well-meaning and all that, create barriers and make it harder. And I remember an early one of my first client experiences. I was representing a large kind of family foundation, and they were really interested in expanding a network of school-based health clinics in the Bronx through a network of high schools there. And I was basically sent up there, all right, as the kind of program officer, to do my due diligence and learn about what was going on and advise as to whether or not this was something, that was worth the investment. But again, remember the background and sort of upbringing that I'm talking about, right? So here's, kind of the preppy white guy in his, late 20s with his suit on and his briefcase. And, I have not been above 96th Street, in New York. And for those of you who know New York, that's sort of a, bit of a dividing line in the city between kind of, wealthier sort of white elite in New York and then Harlem and ultimately up into the Bronx. And so, I'm visiting a predominantly Black high school, with an administrative office that's at the end of a long hallway, and I'm entering as, classes are getting out, and it's like, the typical hustle and bustle, from a high school perspective. And I remember the feeling of walking to meet the principal and some students as well. And I was uncomfortable, right? And I felt like more like fear and anxiety than I felt, than I feel like I should have felt. And I look back on it, and a lot of that is just sort of the impact of a lot of negative stereotypes that I was growing up with, that immediately kind of came to my frontal lobe at that time, right? And at the time, I didn't necessarily, I wasn't like processing that in the way that I process it today. I mean, in some respects, it kind of sounds ridiculous that I'm sharing that with kind of what I know and how I engage with folks today. But back then, that was a new experience for me, a different experience. But when I spent time with the principal there and some of the administrators from the hospital system, and also got to meet the students there and got to learn directly from those students and administrators about the importance of the health clinic, why it was needed, why a network of them were needed, understanding that the majority of issues that were more around kind of mental health issues from various traumas that were either experienced at home, or at that time there was a lot of gang related activity in some of the schools, but that there were also a lot of basic needs like just dental and vision and kind of basic healthcare needs, that I had assumed, sort of were already being provided, right? But I also got to hear about their hopes and dreams, not just what the challenges were that they were facing. And, a lot of what they shared, with their hopes and dreams were, and things they wanted for themselves and for their families were the same things I wanted, right? And so it was a bit of a realization for me that, look, we've got a lot more in common than not, without question. But it also was a point in time that helped me realize that there are a lot of people that have, they had more barriers than I had, and also different kinds of barriers. And so it made me, I don't know, it tapped something inside me to be really curious about that and to want to sort of better understand why that is and sort of how to solve for that, I guess. And so I've spent, sort of the last 20 years or so with that, kind of carrying a lot of that in my mind and trying to be more proximate in an effort to learn. And I think that's translated to some of the stuff that we do at Hollingsworth for sure, but really getting to know people, getting to know what motivates them, et cetera. But the other piece was the systems piece. And I talk to our staff about this all the time, about asking why at least, 3 or 4 times, right? And because RPA taught me that the more you ask why, the question, why is something happening? And then you follow it up with a why and another why, you ultimately, it's a quick way to get to, sort of the root of a problem. And inevitably, I was kind of finding that the root of the problem was always some sort of policy level thing, some institutional practice issue, some sort of mental model or mindset that existed that was creating barriers to progress. It was a lot less about, sort of individual kind of motivation and, and wanting to be successful. And that was also where I learned a lot about, things like redlining. And it's, in a lot of historical, policies that were in place that have had an impact, negative impact today, whether it was that, whether it was sort of the kind of limited impacts of the lack of impact of, say, like the GI Bill for that excluded a lot of Black Americans from an opportunity to receive sort of post-secondary education or gain access to low interest mortgages, things like that. But it was always this myriad of policies and mindsets. And so it's that combination of the proximity piece and this importance of systems that I think influenced me in my arrival to Hollingsworth Funds. And I moved to Greenville in 2010. I'm married a Greenvillian, for those of you who know me, Carrie. And she actually had left Greenville never to come back because she had her own kind of challenges with Greenville, and she was looking to be in New York. And so when I suggested that we move back to Greenville, she was like, well, wait a second, I married you because you live in New York, and I thought we would stay here. But I fell in love with Greenville at the time for a lot of reasons that people from the outside love Greenville today. Sort of this quality of life, the top 10 everything. I mean, even though it wasn't necessarily that in 2010, you could see sort of the writing on the wall. And from my lens, in my world, in my view, that was a really good thing. I wanted to be a part of that. I wanted my children to be a part of that. And so we made the decision to move. I actually commuted back and forth for about 3 years. I didn't actually work for Hollingsworth Funds at the time. I ended up being a consultant through RPA to Hollingsworth Funds. That's how I made my way here. But when I joined Hollingsworth Funds, it was one of those, like, we do consulting work and we give them the 32-page PowerPoint deck and say, hey, we don't do implementation. And thankfully, some of the board members of Hollingsworth turned that around and said, hey, we'd like you to actually do this work for us. And I hadn't really thought about that seriously, but was really excited at the opportunity. And at the time, it also coincided with the release of Raj Chetty's study on economic mobility, which I know many of you are probably familiar with. And for those of you who aren't, I would encourage you to check it out. But it really resonated with me because this perception that Greenville's growth, sort of suggests amongst a lot of folks that, that sort of all boats are rising with being on all these top 10 lists. The Chetty study kind of put a very localized focus on the fact that, Greenville County, as great as we thought we were, is actually one of the worst places for people in the bottom quintile of household income to make their way up, especially, like twice as challenging for, if you were Black or Hispanic or Latinx here in Greenville, it was twice as hard. And so for me, that was like another, not that I didn't have a sense for that, but it was another kind of eye opener, I think, for me and also for us at Hollingsworth Funds. And so, it was another opportunity for us to ask that why question a bunch more times and to kind of get a sense for, what's behind that. And so that sort of led to us really thinking about some of the systemic barriers, right, associated with college and career readiness, access to jobs that are paying a living wage. This issue of housing and transportation is barriers to that. And also just sort of the capacity and infrastructure that we need to support to kind of change a mindset about a community. And so we do focus, obviously, a lot of you have heard me talk about this. We focus a lot, at the systems level, right? We really recognize that we can't go about this kind of change and sort of removing a lot of systemic barriers on our own. And so this sense of kind of collaboration and getting more proximate in relationship with a lot of other players from public, private, nonprofit, kind of neighborhood leadership is critically important. We are conscious of what our definition of an equity lens is and how we practice that. I think we're like everyone else, we're grappling with many of those same issues. I think we think about equity and racial equity in particular as, look, this isn't a zero-sum game, right? I like to borrow from Angela Glover Blackwell's curb cut effect, in her definition, it's like, so when we create the circumstances that allow those who have been left behind to participate and contribute more fully, that we sort of all win, right? And so it's not a zero-sum game. And indeed, if we close the gap on a lot of the racial inequities in Greenville in particular, we'd actually add nearly 10% or almost $3 billion to our local GDP. And that should be something that makes all of our lives a lot better here in Greenville. And so in addition to that, you've heard us talk a lot about sort of our SMRF capital. So the social, moral, intellectual, reputational, and financial capital, we really try and deploy all of that. Tammy will tell you, and I see Allison on the phone as well, or on the call as well, like, we probably spend more time expending social capital and reputational capital and getting into relationships with folks and convening and advocating and championing various policies that help kind of remove some of these barriers in Greenville than we do in the actual execution of making a grant or investment. And we think that's a pretty powerful thing. And so it's led us to be able to, either initiate or kind of be part of a lot of collective initiatives here in Greenville. So something like On Track Greenville that is identifying middle school students in real time who are sort of struggling with some of the key dropout precursors. And it's really helped actually shift the way that Greenville County Schools sort of views the whole child in their system, and they've changed some of their policies and practices as a result. Same with our involvement in the Greenville Housing Fund and how they're addressing some of the challenges of our affordable housing deficit, but also really thinking about more inclusive land use policies that are going to impact our growth. And then more recently, there's a newish initiative called the Racial Equity and Economic Mobility Commission, which is really aiming to kind of elevate the dialogue around racial equity in Greenville. And kind of help change the community mindset around inclusive growth, because we're a growing community. We'll be growing for the next 20 years, we're at least slated to. And so how are we going to grow differently than the last 20 years? And so anyway, and I'll wrap up here in a sec. We've also kind of learned I should say, looked a little bit more internally, at how Hollingsworth can kind of live into its vision and mission. Debbie mentioned that, we have a kind of recently refreshed vision and mission that's got language that's more explicit, kind of naming equity in our vision, talking about the importance of removing systemic barriers directly in our mission, naming sort of who, more specifically, who's being left behind in our community. Thinking a little bit more, and we still have work to do on this, like many other organizations, but really thinking about the right people in the right seats from a board and staff perspective. And I can talk more about some of those conversations that we've had. Being intentional about our role in supporting kind of neighborhood-led organizations that are part of the solution. And so what does that look like for us? And are we doing our part, and not just thinking about sort of 50,000 foot level policy decisions, but who's actually executing on some of that. And then for us, it's a little bit different than some. We own a lot of real estate, and we own a lot of real estate that is right in the development patterns of Greenville. And we happen to have a redevelopment opportunity along Lawrence Road off of I-85, for those of you who are familiar with that. That's 100+ acres, where we've just released a vision for a more vibrant, kind of mixed use development that we hope will be able to use our physical real estate to kind of manifest support for some of the things that we care about. So building more affordability into residential, recruiting and retaining companies that are paying a living wage or hiring more diverse workforces, thinking about opportunities for local women-owned, minority-owned businesses and how they might participate, and creating space for them. So lots of interesting things going on. And the last thing I'll leave you with before kind of jumping off to Tammy is that in doing a lot of that work, some of the things we struggle with a lot is this idea of absorption rate that I talk about a lot. And that at the end of the day, people can only change at a rate that they can absorb. And you can't, it's very, and everybody comes at a different, everybody's got a different starting place there. And, as we all know, these days are quite a bit more polarizing than perhaps they have been in the past. And it's very difficult to keep people from sort of shutting down. And I think the importance of being patient and really getting to know people at a much deeper level is that much more important these days. And being okay with where they are and meeting them where they are, not trying to force them to move more quickly than they want to. I think it creates a challenge for us at Hollingsworth because, some people think we're not doing enough. Others think we're doing too much, whether it relates to issues of race equity or some of these systemic barriers that we're talking about. And I think that's a constant, like, art versus science challenge for us. And so that pace of change and how we do that is just a tough one. So, but I'm happy to talk more about that. I know I'm kind of going on here for a little bit as Tammy and Debbie are smiling at me because they know that I've never done anything in 20 minutes. So let me ask Tammy to kind of share a couple of reflections on what I've said, and maybe share some of her own, and then we can do some Q&A here if it's helpful.
Yeah, Gage, I thank you for being so transparent and vulnerable in this space. I've known, you said it earlier, I've known you now for almost 7 years, and it's interesting to hear about your journey, right, to who you are today. I don't know if the guy back in 2001, if I would have liked him or met him, just be frank. And so I'm really curious about your journey, right? You talked about when you had the experience when you got to RPA with going to the school and the importance of getting proximate and asking questions to get to know people. And as people, as some folks are trying to be more proximate, understand others more, sometimes there's a balance between getting to know people and doing harm. by asking questions about their journey, by, that there's some harm that can be brought with that. And so what were some of the things that you did to prepare yourself for that? What were some of the mistakes that you made, and what did you learn from those, and how did you show up as a result of those mistakes differently?
That's a good question.
I work for you. I always ask good
you should send me
questions.
these things in advance. I mean, no, I'm kidding.
Well, it just came to me as you were talking.
No, it's good. It's good. I think that kind of do no harm piece is a really important one, because as I sort of raced into this field, and I care a lot. I get super excited over stuff. I've got a lot of energy and a big battery around these kinds of issues. But, early on in my career, and still today, I can sort of outpace myself sometimes and the situation at hand. And I think, without question, there have been some times where I have, in my aim to learn, right? I have been super inquisitive and asked lots of questions, and asked for a lot of people's time who are different from me, either from a race or ethnic background or socioeconomic status. And in my effort to learn, I sometimes feel like I have taken maybe more energy from them than I have given back. And in doing that, I'm asking people to relive a lot of stuff, and I'm digging into their kind of personal background, and I think not always paying attention to how that feels. And we were having this conversation with Debbie and Alex before we even got on the phone or got on this call, and it was I was asking about whether just the removing our blinder sessions in general are getting a little bit tiring for some. To listen to, white leaders like myself share, what probably is this, while we all have different stories, there is this kind of through line of, some period of awakening, or a new lens that you've put on, or blinders that you've removed, right? And for a lot of folks, it's like, oh my gosh, do we have to listen to this again? Like, can't we just get to the work, kind of thing? Or having to sort of relive elements of either trauma in their life, or things that, were not a really kind of healthy experience. So I don't know that I would kind of out specific examples and people I've had that with, but I've definitely had people kind of close to our organization, and in the community, be vulnerable with me afterwards, as well, and be like, hey, that was just, I know you're trying, I know you mean well, but that was a little too much. And I actually had to I had to take a break from that conversation, for a couple of days, just to, do some recovery stuff. And that to me was sort of eye opening. I'm like, I don't that's not my intent, right? I don't want to do that. But again, that's not the experience that I've had. So I'm just coming at it from, the lens that I know and the environment that I grew up in. I don't know if that's answering your question, but.
I thought I heard somebody. Yeah, I think so I met one of your mentors, Judy Belk, who is the CEO of the California Wellness Foundation. She is a phenomenal woman who happens to be Black, and thought the world of you. And so can you talk a little bit about how working with Judy influenced your approach to your work?
Yeah, she's a very special human being. And I encourage y'all to look her up. I'm sure she's got some kind of YouTube, videos of sessions that she's participated in or whatever, but very dynamic woman. And I'm trying to remember some of her, kind of family history and stuff, but I believe her mom was one of the kind of first in Virginia to be kind of integrated back into public school system, and she's just she was a special person in my life, still is. I think I mean, if nothing else, she was very open and kind of vulnerable with her own perspective, right, on her life and how she grew up, and translating that to our work in philanthropy, and just giving me things to pay attention to, questions I should be asking, kind of removing certain, I don't know, she was sort of helped sort of remove some of the blinders. I wish I had talked to her before I walked into the high school in the Bronx, as an example, because then I share that experience, and she very quickly says, oh, no, this is not how you go about that. You do this and this and this, and here's how you enter into a conversation about this and listen to people more. And so yeah, I mean, I'd have to kind of think about that one a little bit more, because
that's fine. So there's one more thing I'm going to ask you, and kind of leave some room for some others. You talked about our work and how we're focused on systems change, and the reality is that I think everyone is involved in systems change in some way, or they interact with the system, because we all are within one. And a lot of times in this work, the people who hold the power to make change don't look like the folks who are moving throughout the system and encountering the barriers that are holding them back, right? And so, I think it might be helpful for some folks to hear about, how you, and you might have said this, I just want you to say it again, probably, how you approach that work. And because I think that approach is beneficial, whether you are someone who looks like me, someone who works in the way that we work, or someone who's in a direct service organization. I think it's important for all of us to understand that we sit within systems, we work within them. And if we, and the importance of partnering with others, and the lens through which we need to work through to get to there. There's a whole lot in that. So you just
I guess I'd phrase it this way. I think that Hollingsworth Funds, myself as a leader, you as well, Tammy, and for many of you on the phone, I think we need to sort of take advantage of our advantage in these situations. I think that I think, Tammy, where you're going is there are a lot of people, obviously who don't have voice or limited voice, right? And we recognize that, like, where a lot of decisions are getting made for other people, right, in our community, lay in, whether it's in the political system or kind of corporate, influencer system, et cetera. I think we have a responsibility to kind of bridge that connection, help people certainly at the, that are more in kind of your wealthier white elite, positions of power, as an example, better recognize and help understand the importance of providing, an opportunity for more voice, and why that voice is important. And so I think, we often kind of stand up in meetings or raise a hand and try and broker that to some extent. And I think we have to do more and more of that, because I think in our community as well, I think we're less, we're hesitant to do that. And I think there are, as a foundation, right, that's somewhat, somewhat independent, right? We have a lot of capital to social capital and reputational capital to use. And so I think stepping into that is super important. And I think we've done some of that. And I think a lot of other organizations in our community are doing that as well, right? Thinking about how we encourage, frankly, just in the kind of our system of government, like start advocating more specifically for, seats on, boards, whether it's, Greenlink or, other commissions and planning commissions and things like that. And advocating for more people with voice to sit in those positions, whether it's just, being more inclusive around some of the collective initiatives that we have and the tables that we in many ways are kind of helping to create, whether good or bad there, making more room there, thinking about that within our own organizations. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers the question.
It does, because there were several in it. So thank you.
I'd open it up to, thank you for the two of you sharing your conversation. Are there others in the room that might have a question for Gage? And while you're phrasing that, maybe putting it into the chat, I did have a question, and I think this relates to whether we're a grant maker or a nonprofit organization, but this relates to the whole board issue. And we know this work is so important, but it has to be driven down from the board in terms of how we incorporate it into our work. And I'm wondering, you mentioned earlier there was some evolution with your board and where you've been, how you've been along the way, and where you are today with a new vision and mission and all of the work you've done. And if you have tips for organizations about working with your board on these issues, because it's so critical to actually accomplishing anything.
Yeah, I'll certainly look for Tammy's perspective on this as well, since she's ridden right along with me in the evolution of Hollingsworth and its board. And if I don't know if mine or others are on the call, and they're welcome to chime in too. But yeah, we have evolved a lot. I mean, when Hollingsworth was originally started, it had 7 trustees, and they were there were no term limits, right? And as we've evolved and become more intentional with the work that we want to do, we've also become more intentional with kind of what seats we want to fill. And so we're very intentional about creating a profile of empty seats around the table, and then trying to fill those. We admittedly, we have a great board now, and people with a lot of diverse kind of experiences and opinions. It may not always look like that exactly from a identity perspective right now, and we still have work to do on that. As an example, we talk a lot about change that we hope to see for Hispanic or Latinx population in Greenville, but we don't have any representation on our board currently, or in our staff, right? And so that's something we're intentionally kind of thinking about from an identity perspective. But I think for us, it's a lot of the same things that I talked about before from a relationship perspective. Really we spend a lot of time with our board. I spend a lot of time as CEO, individual kind of one-on-one time with board members, really getting to understand them, where they're coming from, because there's so many, there's a lot of different places that they're coming from. And we also went through, sort of during COVID, some planning work where we utilized a combination of sort of exposure to partners and getting them more educated about what's going on in the community, but also using things like the Angela Glover Blackwell's curb cut effect, or the business case for racial equity from the Kellogg Foundation, as sort of these using sort of data, right, both quantitative and qualitative, to present sort of a point of view or a position that we wanted to pursue, maybe as staff, and having them sort of react and sort of grapple with that. And those kinds of interactions with your board at that level, not just going through the perfunctory, hey, let's do the updates on X, Y, and Z, and let's approve this, and sort of those fiduciary things, but having those more kind of vulnerable, sort of deeper conversations with them, and doing that on a pretty consistent basis, or weaving that into to each of your board meetings, or creating opportunities, between board meetings for people to learn, or for you to engage in that kind of dialogue, even if it's in a small group perspective, I think has really helped our board sort of gel around sort of our vision and mission. I mean, they were the ones that really developed that new refresh vision and mission, and they were the ones that had the input on dissecting the language in there, and what that meant, and how that manifests itself. And so we still have a lot of work to do. I mean, I do not take everything I'm saying right now at Hollingsworth as if we've got it all figured out. We actually have quite a bit of work to do internally, but yeah, I'm hoping that's helpful. But happy to talk more offline with folks too, if we're always available for that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the only thing I would add to that is just you have to create an entry point. You have to understand that everybody's coming from, everybody has different experiences, different perspectives. And so what is the lowest common denominator, if you will, that you can use to bring folks to the table. And so for us, we thought it was really important to at least start with groundwater from the Racial Equity Institute, their trainings. And Gage mentioned it before, curb cut effect. Curb cut was really, that article was, I think, a turning point in our discussion about equity, what it means, and also, you know, along with the other supporting documents, getting behind how we landed where we are, sharing the clips about redlining and how that shows up and affects people's economic mobility even today. But yeah, we happy to talk to anybody and share everything that we've learned. But I think it's important to think about who you're serving and what is the narrative, what is the story that you're trying to tell, and how do you bring your board as well as your staff along that journey, so that when you are making those decisions, you're thinking about the people first and the inform and later.
And I'm noticing, by the way, Katie's side's just popping off every single. This is what I love about our team. It's like I talk too much. Tammy distills that. Katie immediately takes it right to the okay. So what is it that he's talking about? So.
Yeah, so I encourage everyone to look in the chat box, because I was going to point the same thing out. Katie's right on the ball there and is given links to these important documents or these articles. So thank you for that. Yeah, and I also went through the REI program, and yeah, it was a really meaningful thing for me to learn about.
I mean, I will add this, like the thing that we're not, that I think we're not doing enough of, though, is we're not, you know, we are still not, and I don't know whether this is like some post-COVID fog here or what, but we are, or it's just a function of some, you know, existing I don't know, trepidation or whatever of being confident in what we care about and who we are. But we still have more work to do to get more proximate as an organization, getting our board more proximate, our staff as well, and you know, not you know, even though a lot of these tools, articles, you know, research, et cetera, I mean, that's all extremely important, really helps kind of ground us and make sure we're not walking into a situation and asking a bunch of questions that are creating harm, right? But there is no substitute for a one-on-one or small group kind of personal relationship, and making sure that we are learning and responding appropriately, you know, and directly to what's happening in our community, because you can get kind of lost in theory, without question. I'm certainly guilty of that as anyone, and especially when you're talking about systems level change, you know, that is a very, you know, high level policy practice theory kind of based thing. And sometimes I think I don't want to say we lose sight of it. I just think, you know, sometimes that's not always as kind of frontal lobe for us as it needs to be. And that's something that we're working on as well. Again, not anything that you guys, you know, I'm preaching to the choir here, but
yeah,
it's an important reminder.
So I just want to make one comment about that. So for me, it's a balancing act, because as you know, my identity, I'm a Black female. And so I'm always thinking about the community, because of my own experience and how I grew up and what I, you know, and how it influences what I think about, how I show up every day. For me, it's been kind of I don't want to say challenge, I'll say a balancing act on how do you hold this conversation about systems change, because I have an appreciation for it. It's why I got into philanthropy, with also ensuring that the voice of the people who are moving throughout the system is a part of and influencing the decisions that you make and what you invest in, whether it's a financial investment or the other parts of your philanthropic capital. And I think as an organization, because we've been so focused on the theory around systems change and the pieces of that, that now that we're in this place where we have essentially, refreshed our vision and our mission to be more intentional, more specific about what we care about, what we're trying to do. We have a goal that's giving us, some goalposts, if you will, around this is where we'll be focused. Now, I think we have, in my view, something to guide what we would potentially invest in and how we potentially invest in it. And so, as I think about what does that mean for us in our work, trying to be super intentional that we aren't going to the community and extracting, but that we're giving, even as we're trying to, be more proximate, that we are in our proximity, that we aren't taking out, but that we're putting in. So I just wanted to add that because I think it's important, an important part of when you think about how you show up in community. I think, it's great when people want to set up funds for minority-led organizations. But those organizations need more than funding, and they require more from those of us who have some perceived power. It requires more of an investment. And so I've been super protective of that, while also kind of muddling through, what is our role? How do we get more proximate and also add value as we're extracting value?
Is there anything you want to add to that, Gage?
No, I like where she's going with that one.
Yeah, I mean, that was sort of, you captured it, I think, Tammy, in those last words, and because I'm listening to this sort of the balancing act you're talking about, and wow, it's hard to look at systemic change and be proximate and make sure that you are being proximate when you're implementing or looking to change systems. So I appreciate the way you captured that, and I appreciate the two of you being with us this morning and being so vulnerable. I get, Gage, I don't think it's all, maybe even for you, it's not easy to share stories in a platform like this, and Tammy to come on and challenge you and ask you a couple of really hard questions, I think, and you did pretty well, because I don't think you rehearsed those answers. So you did a really good job.
Could you tell,
Yeah. Oh, I kind of tell. But no, I mean, I think that's what this is all about. And you're right, we've got to get beyond removing our blinders to really removing our barriers. And I think that Hollingsworth is on a path to do that. And you're, very kind to say that, you're on a journey, and you're just moving along that journey, and we all are. No one's reached the destination. We hope that someday we can say that, but there's a long way to go. So I appreciate all of your words today. I appreciate everyone being with us today. I hope all of you are reading your Together SC newsletter every 2 weeks for Good Connections, because it is jam-packed with programming coming up over the next weeks and months. And please join your peer networks. That's where my baby is right now, with peer networks. I hope you're joining those as well. But nothing more important than talking about race equity on a Thursday morning. And I thank all of you for being here. And thank you, Gage and Tammy, one more time for sharing your time with us.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.